Oh, well, j'étais. Complication là. Oh, oui, compliqué là.
Good. Not on mute. If you could go ahead and mute yourself during the lecture, that would be great. And anytime you got a question, just go ahead and jump in. All right, so today what we will be going over on August 31st, class 5. Everybody should be in a position where you finished the sketch of your floor plan. If you haven't, that's okay. You will need to do that in order to start this lesson. Your progress for this week is due on Saturday. That way it'll give me a chance to review everything on Sunday and have that back to you on Monday with any kind of changes or anything like that. And this just gives me a way to keep track of your classwork, to make sure that everybody's staying up to date with it, and to make sure that yeah, it looks like nobody's getting lost in it. So we will have weekly check-ins for that. I haven't made that mod live yet, but that will be made live by the end of today. But once again, it's not going to be due until Saturday. So what we're going to be doing today is actually beginning your model. Since everyone has done their own floor plans, you've measured your own floor plans at your house, and there are so many variables that we're looking at when we're looking at creating walls and things. Usually a typical interior wall on a house is 4.5 inches, because you're looking at 1/2 inch of gypboard, 3.5 inches of 2x4 of structural lumber, and another 1/2 inch of gypboard on the other side of that wall. So typically an internal wall is 4.5 inches. That can change, it can fluctuate. There are different sizes of gypboard. And then there's also, you can take into consideration plumbing walls, etc. But just to make things easy to start with, we're all going to use internal walls that are 4.5 inches thick. That being said, for external walls, they will be 5.5 inches thick. Usually external walls are a lot thicker because you're taking into consideration the thickness of the gypboard, the structural lumber. There's usually a substrate, and then there's, can be any type of siding outside your house, be it brick siding, any type of wood siding, shingles, things like that. So just to make things easier on us on this first model, these are the size walls that we'll be creating today: a 5.5 inch exterior and a 4.5 inch interior. We'll learn how to create our own walls. We'll learn how to create materials. There's a couple of different versions on how you can create materials in Revit, but we'll learn one today. And then we'll talk about how you get started in actually creating your model. We're using temporary dimensions and constraints. We touched briefly on temporary dimensions last class, and we'll talk about constraints on this one as well. And then I'm going to turn it over to you to work on your floor plan today. Think of this beginning floor plan as a puzzle. Some people, depending on the experience that you've had in the field, can get this knocked out pretty quickly. Other people, it takes a little bit longer. But the main thing to do is to make sure your dimensions are as close as possible. In industry, you want to make sure your dimensions are accurate. Granted, there's no way for us to double check that right now because, you measured your own house and the distance learning. But any questions that you have when you're doing your project to start with, make sure you bring them to me on Wednesday and we can go over them if you're having trouble getting that done. So we'll go ahead and jump into Revit now and talk about how to create our walls. So I believe I mentioned in this class last week that I was having some issues with my own Revit as far as making sure that everything was loaded in. So I had to delete all Revit off my computer and reload it. So if anyone was having those issues last week, hopefully you were able to do that over the weekend. And if not, you can go ahead and do that now, because when we start a new project, this is what was missing last time. This is the really important part for this class and my MEP class. When you start a new project, you're going to be given this pop-up window and you're going to have a template file. So we're actually going to create a new project, but most of the times when you're working for different firms, they're going to have their own project templates to start with. So you can create a project template here, but we're going to go ahead and start with the preloaded projects that there. So this is going to be a default project when it starts here. And if you do this drop down here, you'll notice there's construction, architectural, structural, and mechanical. You always want to start with, in this class, the architectural template. So when you click on that and you hit OK, there's lots of presets that are already in here that we use for this class. If we take a look at the project browser, you can see how that's broken down. You want to make sure that your project browser looks like this when you start in an architectural template. Let me open up another template just so you can see the difference. I'll just do a construction template. So you can see in the construction template, it's very different. Usually it happens at least once or twice a semester that someone will pick the wrong template and you get kind of confused because you've got all this extra stuff going on that you do not need. So just make sure for this class and for your midterm and final that you are opening the correct template. One other thing, you'll notice that Revit works by windows, so we have a level 1 here. If I click to that tab, it goes back to my level 1 project with the architectural template. If I jump back here to this other level 1, this goes to my construction template. So it'll open a bunch of windows that correspond to all our different views that we're working on. So for this one, I'm just going to close this, and the only one I have active now is my architectural template. So the first thing I want to do, and probably what's I recommend the most when we're lecturing in class, is that you just watch. A lot of people try and go along at the same time. It's a lot more difficult now since we have to watch our screen and do things at the same time. So with the recording, it should be easier for you to just kind of watch, take it in, take notes, and then practice it later. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our first wall. We're going to create our external wall. So when we do that, we want to go to our architecture tab, our build panel, and our wall tool. So when we click on wall tool, our default in our type selector goes to a basic generic image wall. One thing to remember is whenever you're starting a new wall or material, you always want to start with a generic. That way there's no presets that are in there in that property already that are going to cause a problem for when you create your own. So I always recommend to start with a generic. Since we're creating our wall and we're going to change the thickness of it, it doesn't matter if you start with a 5-inch, a 6-inch, an 8-inch generic, as long as it's a generic. So when we click on that, it makes that wall active. So now the basic wall generic 8 inches active. The first thing we want to do to create our own wall is go into edit type. When we get edit type, we get this new window up. And we always want to duplicate and rename it. So since I'm creating my external wall, I'm going to call that external. Actually, you'll find out that it's good to keep a naming, a way to name things and keep things together. Because things, sometimes it's hard to find stuff. So a good housekeeping rule is just kind of like name things consistently. So since this is a wall, I'm going to start with wall, external, 5.5 inches. And then I like to put my initials behind it. That way I know I'm the one that created that wall. I would recommend for this class you doing that also. Once you get into working for different firms, they'll have specific ways that they want you to name things as well. So just for this class, what I'd recommend is doing wall, external 5.5 inches in your initials, and then we'll do wall internal 4.5 inches in initials. So once we've duplicated and renamed, hit OK. Now we have the original basic wall and we have the one we created. And we want to do that because we don't want to change the parameters of the original wall with our new wall. So we're going to go ahead and hit edit. And in this window, once you kind of get the basics of how this works, you'll see how it's going to work for a lot of other procedures that we do in Revit as well. So this information right here compromises the breakdown of how this wall is created. If you notice on here, it's going to give us the function. It gives us the material, and it gives us the thickness. So I find the easiest thing, the best thing to do first is to change the thickness of this wall. So right now this wall is 8 inches. As you can see here, it's 8 inches as well. So we want to click on this part, highlight that, and change that to 5.5 inches. And notice when we change it there, it also changes the thickness here. The next thing I like to do is I like to change the function of the wall. So this is actually going to be structural, so we'll leave that as structure. But when we think about the construction of this wall is actually made up of different components. We're going to estimate a 4.5-inch thick piece of structural lumber. Oops, I do 4.5 inches. Yeah, 4.5 inches. There we go. And we're going to need to add our gypboard. Now, how things are constructed here, you see core boundary, structure, core boundary. The only thing that lies within this core boundary, and it'll always be 0, is the structural element of this wall. So I need to add 2 more pieces of material in here to create those 2 additional pieces of gypboard. So if I come down to here, and I'm going to hit insert twice, it'll pop in 2 new materials when I do that. So I need to move these 2 materials outside of the core boundary. If you take a look closely on here, you'll notice that this is the exterior side of the wall, and this is the interior side of the wall. That means when I'm creating my external wall, I want my external siding material on this side of my wall. Well, I'm going to create the external material here, and I'll have the gypboard on the interior side. So now I need to move these materials outside the core boundary. So with this one active, you click over here, make it active like it is. You can come down to these buttons and move it up. So this one I moved outside of the core boundary, and this one I'm going to move down outside of the core boundary. So you've got like a little cake, layer cake effect. So now I'm going to make this one 1/2 inch for my gypboard. I'm going to make this one 1/2 inch for my gypboard. So now we're going to change the function. We've got always change the thickness first. Now we'll go to function. The function of this exterior side is going to be a finish layer. Now, if this was a structural class, we would go into a lot more detail of how these walls are created with a substrate, with a thermal air barrier, etc. But we're just doing the architectural part of it, so we're going to just do that a little bit. We're going to cheat a little bit on that, especially using these generic walls. If this was like a brick wall, you would make that thickness a lot thicker. But just to keep things simple, we're going to go ahead and just estimate 1/2 inch. And then that's always going to be a finish layer 1. So exterior side is always finish layer 1. For our interior side, we want to change that structure to a finish layer 2. And this helps Revit keep track of where your different materials are going to be located. So at this point, we're going to work on materials. First thing we'll start with is the structural material. It doesn't matter which order, I'm just kind of showing you in this order because I want to end up with the exterior material last. So for my structural material, I'll come in here and click this little box right here, which will pop up our materials browser. What's cool about Revit, and especially once we get to the rendering part of it, is you're going to have all these different materials you're going to have access to. And Revit comes preloaded with a limited amount of materials, but once we kind of learn how to make our own materials, we can load more materials into this, which is really nice. So For this one, since this is just my structural lumber, I'm going to scroll down to structure. Let's see which one we'll use. Not that one. Let's just use softwood lumber for this one. Just because the constraints that are already in here. There's structural wood joist rafters, but just for this one, everybody just use softwood lumber. So you'll click on softwood lumber and make that active. When you do that, you'll notice that that pops up over here. And it says, we want to make sure that every time we do that, we use render appearance as well, because there's two different ways that we work on appearance here. There's graphics and there's appearance. So under appearance, this is what the material is going to look like in a rendered state, and this is what the stain color is. And you can think of appearance as what the render would look like, and the graphic what the visual styles of consistent color would look like. So if you never clicked on use render appearance, it would always look gray. So make sure that whenever you're in the graphics that we click on use render appearance. That'll all start to make sense the more we play with this. So then we're going to hit OK. So for our finish layer 2, on the interior side, we want to make this gypboard. Gypboard is gypsum wall board, otherwise known as sheetrock. That's just a term that's just used in business in the industry. So here, gyp is the generic term for it. So you just type gyp or gypsum wall board, and that'll pop up there. Click on that. Notice how that changed. So the appearance of this is going to be just be gray anyway, like that. So we still want to click on use render appearance. And we'll hit OK. So here now we've changed these two materials. So there's this next one, this finish layer for exterior side. We're going to add a couple of new things to do with this one. So we'll do the same thing. We'll go ahead and get into the materials browser. And what I was talking about before, when we do this, you can create a new material, or you can use one of the materials that are already loaded in here. Like for instance, if I just wanted to make this brick, I could just hit brick, use render appearance, and hit OK. And now this is brick. Structurally, it's not correct, so you didn't really have a half-inch brick layer, but like I said, we're just using this as an example. And you can like finish this, and this could be your wall to start. But if you wanted to make something more personalized, something closer to what your property looks like, you could leave this as is, but then you could come back in here and you can go back and change the material. This is nice too, because if you change the material, it's a quick way that we can create a new wall and to show your clients really quickly what it would look like as a different type of material. So if we wanted to create our own material on here, and we will be creating a lot of our own materials later on, what we want to do is come down here to this little orb with the plus sign on it, and it says creates and duplicates materials. So if we're creating our own new material, we want to come down here to the orb. We want to create new, which this is the same as like using a generic. You don't want to have anything that's duplicated because it does cause some confusion down the road. So always create new. Here we have where that material is. At this point, you want to right click and rename it. And here you can call it wall, exterior, and this is just a naming tool to help things stay well lined up. Wall, exterior, and let's go with siding, and then my initials. So now I'm creating this new material. It's not assigned anything. It's got this big gray circle here. It doesn't mean anything. It's got nothing to. Now I have to assign information to it, so it's a new material. With this active, I come back down here to open and close asset browser. We have another great window that pops up, and this is where things get really fun. What I'd recommend for you to do is change the view to thumbnail. It's a lot easier to read. And here you can see all the cool stuff that we can load into our project. I would recommend while you're playing with all this stuff today in this week is just kind of go through this and see all the things that you can create. There's different tiles that you can use. These things right here are, this gives you an example of what wall paint would look like, different wall aspects. Here's the acrylic symbol. These are acoustical ceiling tile symbols. We want to stay away from using acoustical ceiling tiles in this class because we don't really usually have those in a house setting. We may use those in, when we get to our the second half of the class. Here's some asphalt, here's some more brick, some more wood, different wood types. So you can see there's all sorts of cool stuff that you can use to create whatever whatever you want it to look like. Here's more ceiling tiles. Here's more wall samples. Ceramic wood pattern. So this is where people kind of like go down the rabbit hole and kind of play with all the fun stuff that you can learn how to create. And this is really used a lot in the second half of the class when you have more of design freedom to do what you want. Here's some grass. So for this one, we're just going to come down and use this horizontal beige siding. You can pick whatever one you want, whatever matches closer to your house. I would recommend doing that. But for this, I'm just going to use this horizontal beige. I'm going to double click on that. With this lock symbol up here, this just means that this material is locked. You cannot change its parameters. And double clicking on it is the same as just clicking on here as well. As you can see, it says replaces the current asset in the editor with this asset. So it's taking that generic and it's creating this new asset. Once you have that done, you can go ahead and close the asset browser. As you can see on here, it's changed our appearance to this beige siding. And I'm going to go back to my graphics tab and I'm going to click on use render appearance. That way it's always going to show up in this beige color, whether I'm in the realistic view or the consistent color view. And hit OK, and OK, and OK, all the way out. So now I have created my own basic wall, external 5.5 inches, and my initials, so I know I did it. So now I get to start drawing. If we look at our options bar, the options bar is very similar to the one that we played with last week, with the height is unconnected, and the limited height is 20 feet. The chain is set to on, which I want, and that way I can start drawing. So here I can go ahead and, depending on what your measurements are, what the heck? So y'all, hopefully y'all saw that weird message saying that we're going to run out of time in class. So if we, obviously it's going to run out, but we're going to start class again. So it'll be 2 recordings for this class. I apologize, I'll get that fixed for next time. But if when we get booted out of class, I'll send another invite. It actually should be the same invite information for each class, and then we'll just go ahead and start over from there. So I apologize for that. So here we'll just go ahead and mark out the measurements of our external wall. Remember, if we want to change those measurements on here, you click the wall opposite, the word perpendicular to it, to get those measurements. Say if this was a internal measured wall and it was 25 feet, I want to make sure that I change my external measurements, my temporary dimensions, to these internal measurements right here. And here I can click on my dimension here and say if I want to make that 25 feet and enter. And if we wanted to use our temporary constraints, we want to go ahead and click on here. Notice how that dimension changes. Click on here again, and you've got a temporary lock that shows up. This is going to constrain it in place, similar to how you constrain things in Inventor. So we're going to click on that lock. Now this is going to stay at 25 feet. There's different ways that well, there's not different ways, but there's a lot of different places that you're going to have to use constraints. And you can always unlock them and lock them, and we'll learn how to process those as we go along. So for your first time doing this, make sure you use the temporary dimensions, but you don't have to use the constraints for now. because sometimes it does get a little frustrating and then we need to kind of fix things, but I do want you to know about that. Once you have this in place, since this is a temporary dimension, it's used just to kind of get the size of the wall. We want to go ahead and delete this, and we'll just hit delete. And let's go ahead and create, since this is our external wall, when you click on the wall, that information is going to show up here in your type selector. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create my internal wall. It's done very similar to creating my external wall. So once again, we're going to go to create an internal wall at 4.5 inches. We're going to go to Architecture tab, Build Panel, Wall Tool. Notice how the default is to the wall I just created, the wall that I just used. I want to change that to a generic. Remember, we always want to start with a generic. I'm going to use a generic 5-inch, this one. I can use 6 as long as it's a generic. I'm just going to use the 5.5-inch one. Once we get that done, the first thing we want to do is hit Edit Type. And then we always want to do Duplicate and Rename. So this one I'm going to call Wall Interior 4.5 inches. And my initials. So we're going to do the exact same thing we did on the last one. We're going to go into Edit. We're going to add our 2 materials because we're going to have gypboard and gypboard. So I'm going to add 2 materials. I'm going to move this one up outside the core boundary. I'll move this one down outside the core boundary. Now we'll change the thickness. Since I know this is going to be gypboard, since it's an interior wall, I'm going to change that to 1/2 inch. Oops. This is going to be 3.5 inches. And even though it's a 2x4, the actual measurements of a 2x4 are 1.5 by 3.5. If it's a 2x6, it's 1.5 by 5.5. So the original measurements of this lumber was correct at 2. Back in the day, it was 2x4, and then, you know, in order to save money, they got shaved down to 1.5 by 3.5. So if I ever ask you what's the actual correct measurements of a 2x4, it would be 1.5 by 3.5. That's why this is 3.5. For our structure here, for our layer here, sorry, this is going to be 1/2 inch because I know this is gypboard. That's 0.5. So now we have our measurements. Whoa, 0.5. There we go. So now we have our measurements correct. The full thickness of this wall is 4.5 inches. Next thing we need to do is change our function. So structurally, this is correct. The only thing in the middle section between the 2 core boundaries is our structural wood lumber. On the exterior side, this is where things get a little bit confusing. So even though this says exterior side, we know this is an internal wall. So every internal wall finish is 2. So you're going to have finish layer 2 on both sides of an interior wall. Now we can go ahead and change our materials. In the material in the structural section, that's going to be, we're just going to use softwood lumber for that. And double click. Oops, I went very fast on that. Let's go back. Okay, I do have user under appearance checked on that. That's good. And now for these 2 material layers, we're going to make those gypboard. So I'll go into this one here. I'll find my gypsum wallboard. User under appearance is set. Hit OK. And for this one as well, gypsum wallboard as well. Double click on that. So this wall is now correct. We have gyp wallboard, softwood lumber, gyp wallboard. Measurements are correct, and the function layers are correct. So this is what you want to be shooting for when you're creating your own wall. And once you're finished this, you want to go ahead and just hit OK, and OK, all the way out. Now, if we come over to our properties and we see our wall interior 4.5 inches, the wall we just created is active. So we want to come back down here. And at the end, we want to just start drawing in our interior walls. And like I said, as you start doing this, because we've measured our own house kind of piece by piece, it's kind of a puzzle for you to put it together. So just take your time and practice that as you're creating it. It does take people a couple of times to get it, so don't worry if it gets a little frustrating at first. You'll definitely get the hang of it. All right, so I want to make sure that this dimension on the inside is correct, so I'll go ahead and I'll click on this. And remember, I made this 25 feet. I'm going to change that to an internal dimension. This is where I find people get most confused, is where they're laying their internal dimensions, where they're setting their temporary dimensions to start, because you can see they can go in a few different places. So it's really important when you get started with these to make sure that those endpoints are starting where you want them to. And here we have our internal dimension to our internal dimension. And let's say that was 21 feet. Now I can click on here, make that 21. And now that size is 21 feet. If I wanted to lock that in place, and you'll learn how to be more comfortable with this as we progress, you can go ahead and click on that dimension symbol. Then we click on the dimension itself, and that will give you your constraint. Then we can lock that in place. We can unlock it. For now, we'll keep it unlocked, but we do not need our temporary dimensions here anymore. Once they get to this part, they'll always show up, but we can delete that, and that dimension will still stay where it needs to be. The difference between locking it and unlocking it, now if I grab one of these walls, it's not going to stay at 25 feet if I accidentally grab the wall and then move it. That's part of the reason that we use the constraints on here, is like if I did have the constraint in place, it would not have moved the wall. So let me show you that. Let me put this back where it should be. So I'll lock this now. Now when I do that, notice the whole thing moves. And the constraint has that locked in place, and it's not going to change. But sometimes we need to make adjustments and then unlock the constraints and things like that. So it's just a matter of practice, and just keep using it, and you'll get the hang of it. Any questions so far?